Alleluia, 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 Alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to his disciples, "As the Father loves me, so I also love you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I've told you this, that my joy might be in you and your joy might be complete. This is my commandment. Love one another as I love you. No one has greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I no longer call you slaves, because a slave does not know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. It was not you who chose me, but I who chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. This I command you. Love one another." The Gospel of the Lord. On this day in the Universal Church, we celebrate the feast of Saint Matthias. And so this feast of Saint Matthias is a very significant feast day in the life of the Church. The feast day of Saint Matthias is one of those times where we see basically the high ecclesiology, right, that is showed forth at the very beginning of the Church's history. Right? High ecclesiology just means that at the very beginning of Christianity, right, there was a really Catholic view of the Church. Right? And so theologians, rather than coming right out and saying that, right, they call it a high ecclesiology, but really what they mean is very Catholic. Right? And the reason why they don't want to call it that, and instead call it a high ecclesiology, right, is a result of a movement that began right, at the time of the Protestant Reformation and has very much picked up steam towards the end of the 1800s and now has trickled down into you and I today, whether we realize it or not. There's been a development of biblical studies that is called form criticism, which basically pulls apart right, the books of the Bible. Right? So at the time of the Protestant Reformation, right, there's this very strong Catholic view of the Scriptures. And around the time of the Protestant Reformation, as you know, with the invention of the printing press, there was much study and publications that became new knowledge. And many of it was focused on the study of the Bible. Right? And so for the first time in many centuries, there were a number of scholars who had access to the original manuscripts right, of the Scriptures. And they started debating and challenging whether or not the translation that people had been reading for centuries was accurate. And so they started to debate this, and eventually it led to many of the reformers basically disregarding the traditional understandings right, of the Catholic interpretation of the Scriptures. Some of you may know, in fact, that even until this day, right, Matthew 16, where it talks about giving the keys to Simon Peter, right, the installation of the papacy. To this day, one of the things that Protestants will bring up is that it is a bad translation. And so that shows you the effects of this debate. But how it has come to affect you and I, whether we realize it or not, is that eventually, at the end of the 1800s, this movement became so strong that it basically started to put everything in the Bible up for grabs. And it has had such a successful impact that, again, you and I don't even realize it. Like for the simple fact that when you ask the average Christian or the average Catholic, right, who wrote the book of Genesis? or the book of Exodus, right, or any of the other first books of the Pentateuch. Right? And everybody will likely say, we don't know. But for all of Jewish and Christian history leading up until that time, everybody would have said Moses, of course, was the writer. Or when we think about the prophets, like the prophet Isaiah, for example, right? Many of you are familiar if you've ever taken any sort of basic seminar or Bible study on the book of Isaiah, right? You'll be told how there's 3 different Isaiahs, that the book of Isaiah is split up into 3 parts that had 3 different authors. Again, that is a complete invention. Nowhere in Jewish or Christian history was that ever thought until the end of the 1800s. Now you also have people who, even evaluating the New Testament, they try to say that, Matthew was not the real author of the Gospel of Matthew, and neither was Mark or Luke or John. They'll try to say that many of those biblical books, they were not even written at the time of the apostles. They keep moving the dates back and saying, well, really it was just written way later. And all of it has led to a tremendous amount of skepticism about the Bible. And not only that, but also skepticism about the church. Because as a result of this, what these scholars have said is, for all of Christian history, everybody thought that the early church was very Catholic. But now we recognize that that is an invention. And any time these biblical books seem to show the Catholicity of the church, it's obviously a later invention. Because we all know that the early church was really just this group of disciples who preached peace and forgiveness, but had no care for the liturgy or the Mass or the papacy or Mary or the Eucharist or any of those things. And that is what is under attack. And so again, many people, when they read the Acts of the Apostles, they say, this is just such a high ecclesiology. There's no way this could be accurate. Thankfully, in scholarship, people are finally starting to fight back against this, and the tide is very much turning. But again, one of the ways we see that is in this reading for this feast day of St. Matthias. In this reading, we see that when one of the apostles had removed himself, that they had to find a successor. That when Jesus established the apostles, he didn't meant for it to be a temporary institution. He meant for it to last. And when any apostle would die or be removed, another should take his place. Just as Simon Peter, being the first pope, the man with the keys, when he was martyred, another was chosen to take his place. In this reading, we also see that the apostles, when they were choosing Matthias, they cast lots for him, which again is a sign of the difference that had been taking place. In the Old Testament, casting lots was only permitted to be done by priests. And so we see that the apostles very much understood that they were not just traveling preachers, but priests. When St. Peter quotes the Psalms about replacing the office of Matthias, he says, "May another take his office," which in Greek is the word episkopane, which is where we get the word episcopacy, and we still use today to describe the role of every bishop. He is an episkopos who oversees an episcopane. All of these things are showed forth in the Acts of the Apostles, and especially on this feast of St. Matthias. We can already see at the very beginning of the church the roots of the same Catholicism that we still believe and hold to today.